Tonight, we not just talking about architecture, we walking into the bones of history itself. Structures so defiant they laughed at time, defied fire, and survived tenants who thought bathing was witchcraft. These walls didn't just hold up roofs, they held up empires. So grab your torch, your imaginary sword, and that sense of medieval wonder, because we about to explore the castles that turned fear into stone and arrogance into architecture. Before castles became romantic ruins for tourists and Netflix dramas, they were Europe's way of saying, we've officially given up on peace. After Rome collapsed, civilization took a several hundred-year nap. The continent turned into a free-for-all of raids, revenge, and bad hygiene. Everyone with a sword wanted land, and everyone with land wanted walls. Thus, the Motte and Bailey was born, a wooden fort on a man-made hill, surrounded by a fence, because nothing says impenetrable defense like slightly elevated lumber. These forts were cheap, fast, and about as durable as a breadstick. Fire was their worst enemy, followed closely by wind, and the occasional angry goose. If a rival lord didn't burn it down, the weather eventually would. Medieval builders called them temporary, raiders called them kindling. Then someone had the revolutionary idea that maybe, just maybe, fortresses shouldn't be flammable. Enter stone, the medieval version of an upgrade patch. Stone didn't burn, didn't rot, and made peasants stop asking for raises. But it came at a price, expensive, heavy, and demanding an army of masons, engineers, and disposable laborers. Construction took decades, which was fine, since most lords weren't planning on moving anyway. And when they were finally done, that stone keep wasn't just a fortress. It was a medieval status update that said, I own this valley, and possibly God's approval. The Normans took this to Olympic levels. After invading England in 1066, they built castles everywhere, sometimes to claim land, sometimes just to scare the locals. Within a century, England had over 1,000 stone castles, each declaring, welcome to feudalism. Population, you. Early stone castles were ugly but effective. No comfort, no plumbing, and windows smaller than your phone screen. They were fortresses first, homes second, and damp caves third. But they worked, because nothing says do not invade quite like a wall thick enough to outlive your grandchildren. The wooden fort had been humanity's hopeful shrugged. The stone castle, its grim, magnificent middle finger. Once the first stone castles rose, lords realized something crucial. Safety was nice, but showing off was even better. Building a castle wasn't just about surviving sieges. It was about bragging rights in high-definition masonry. Every turret, tower, and portcullis screamed, I'm richer, smarter, and slightly more paranoid than you. In an age without Instagram, you didn't need followers. You needed battlements. Lords competed to outbuild each other, throwing absurd sums of money and unpaid labor at their projects. Castles became less about strategy and more about social status. Medieval skyscrapers for men terrified of irrelevance. The higher your keep, the greater your ego. And nothing said I'm untouchable like forcing an entire village to look up at your house while plowing your fields. Feudalism was simple like that. The peasants worked, the lord built towers, and everyone pretended this was God's plan. But not every lord was a military genius. Some were just rich men with too much free time and crippling insecurity. They built castles in bogs, cliffs, and flood zones, anywhere that looked dramatic. Function was secondary to aesthetic domination. After all, Who needs drinking water when your castle's shadow flexes on your neighbors? Inside, things weren't much better. Most lords lived in constant anxiety, not from invaders, but from servants who knew where the food was. They fortified dining halls, locked bedchambers, and invented indoor arrow slits purely out of trust issues. Yet, for all their paranoia, these lords created masterpieces. A single castle could employ hundreds, masons, carpenters, smiths, and one poor soul whose only job was to yell at everyone carrying rocks. The design process was brutal. No blueprints, no computers, just guesswork, and one soaked apprentice holding a plumb line in the rain. By the 12th century, the castle wasn't just a fortress. It was the status symbol. Bigger walls, taller towers, deeper moats, stone-shaped ego trips that could survive a siege, an earthquake, or a bad marriage. The message was clear. Come for me if you dare. Just remember, my walls have walls. In the Middle Ages, one architectural rule reigned supreme. If you're going to build a castle, build it somewhere annoying, preferably on a hill so steep it offends gravity itself. Why? Because gravity, that ancient, unpaid bodyguard, works best when it's on your side. Every step uphill drained an invader's breath, dignity, and will to live. From above, you could see them coming days in advance, and spend that time deciding whether to fight or just mock them. Strategically brilliant, but miserable for everyone else. Builders hauling stone up goat paths cursed the day their lord discovered elevation. Oxen reconsidered evolution. Servants hated it too. Imagine carrying dinner up 3 terraces and a drawbridge just to hear, "Actually, I'm not hungry." But oh, the view. From below, the castle looked divine, majestic, unreachable, godlike. From above, it was damp, cold, and permanently foggy. Still, lords loved it. Altitude was power. A daily reminder to peasants that power literally lived above them. The castle on the hill was just a fortress. It was a statement. You can see me, but you'll never reach me. And then came the moat, Europe's most ambitious puddle. Nothing says keep out quite like a giant ditch full of disappointment. In theory, it was brilliant. A watery trench that made siege towers useless and ladders suicidal. Medieval anti-personnel landscaping at its finest. In practice, though, mostly mud, mosquitoes, and regret. Fairy tales lied. Most moats weren't shimmering blue rivers. They were brown, stagnant nightmares filled with dead fish, trash, and the occasional They smelled like divine punishment and looked worse. But if you were an attacker, that smell alone might change your career path. Some moats weren't even wet, just dry ditches filled with spikes, rocks, or creative ways to break your legs. Engineers loved them so much they sometimes built 2, because, in medieval times, if something was a bad idea, doubling it made it genius. The real power of the moat wasn't physical. It was psychological, a muddy, smelly message that said, "You can try to reach me, but you'll regret every step of it." It wasn't just defense. It was psychology. The moat told every would-be invader, "You're not even close to my wall, and you're already losing." From across that muddy trench, defenders hurled arrows, insults, and occasionally last night's dinner. It was war, yes, but with flair. Medieval theater at its finest. Of course, moats came with a few logistical nightmares. They flooded during rain, froze in winter, and occasionally drowned the castle's own livestock, draining them. That was a full-time job in humiliation. And if your castle didn't sit near a river, congratulations. You now had an enormous, empty ditch that filled with regret every spring. Still, no self-respecting lord skipped the moat. It was the medieval version of a home security system, mostly useless, but it looked important. When guests visited, lords would casually brag, "Oh, bandits never make it past the water." Technically true. Most lost a boot, a little pride, and went home smelling like despair. The moat was a monument to fear, vanity, and bad drainage, a puddle with a purpose. Then came the gatehouse architecture's equivalent of a fake smile. Polite on the outside, murderous on the inside. It looked welcoming from afar. Tall towers, banners fluttering, drawbridge down, sunlight glinting on stone. A vision of hospitality, right, until you got within 5 minutes of it. Then came the arrows, the portcullis, and the regret. The gatehouse was genius paranoia, made stone, a combination of geometry, deception, and gravity that only a medieval architect with trust issues could invent. Once attackers crossed the drawbridge, the trap snapped shut, portcullises dropped, gates slammed, and suddenly you were standing in a stone tunnel designed specifically to ruin your afternoon. Above, murder holes, charmingly named openings, where defenders could drop rocks, boiling oil, or on budget days, whatever was lying around. On both sides, arrow slits, turning the narrow passage into a blender powered by screaming. It wasn't an entrance, it was a meat grinder with good masonry. Defenders adored it. Attackers developed trauma. Even male couriers probably needed therapy. And just when you thought medieval architects might stop there, they didn't. Some gatehouses had multiple portcullises because one wasn't traumatic enough. Others featured secondary drawbridges over smaller moats, forcing attackers to juggle ladders, siege towers, and self-esteem all at once. Ironically, the gatehouse often doubled as guard housing. Yes, people actually lived in the same place where boiling oil occasionally rained from the ceiling. Imagine trying to sleep, knowing your ceiling hatch might open and drop a flaming boulder. Still, no feature captured the twisted genius of castle design quite like the gatehouse. It was both architecture and performance artist stage, where overconfident invaders learned humility while defenders enjoyed front-row seats to the carnage. The drawbridge might have said, "Welcome." The gatehouse always followed up with "just kidding." It was the medieval version of customer service friendly until you tried to enter without permission. Nothing in a medieval castle was accidental, especially the stairs. Those narrow, spiraling, ankle-breaking death traps weren't bad design. They were strategic cruelty carved into stone. Most staircases spiraled clockwise as they went up. To the average visitor, that meant inconvenience. To a defender, it meant physics with a grudge. Since most soldiers were right-handed, attackers climbing upward found their sword arms pinned against the central column, while defenders above could swing freely. It was like fighting in a corkscrew-shaped hallway designed by someone who hated you personally. And these weren't even normal stairs. Each step was uneven in height and depth, perfect for tripping anyone foolish enough to rush. Servants cursed them in peacetime. Soldiers died on them in war. Either way, the architect got his money's worth. As the staircase climbed, it narrowed, forcing attackers to go one by one, basically a medieval version of take a number and die in order. Make it to the top, and you'd be exhausted, dizzy, and questioning every life decision that brought you there. Some castles even reversed the spiral direction between towers, so if you survived the first staircase, the next one would sabotage your sword arm all over again. That wasn't just defense. That was psychological warfare with steps. Of course, spiral stairs weren't all about battle. They were space efficient too. They tucked neatly into towers, leaving room for more important things like storage, bedrooms, or additional murder holes. But living with them, a daily workout from hell. Lords, servants, and guests climbed these stone tornadoes while carrying armor, food, or chamber pots. One slip, and your dayon, possibly your life, was over. Still, the spiral staircase remains one of history's most diabolically clever inventions, an elegant mix of mathematics, malice, and mild inconvenience. Not bad designs, bad intentions made beautiful. If you've ever wondered why castle windows are so small, congratulations, you've just spotted the medieval version of a machine gun nest. Those thin slits weren't for sunlight or fresh air. They were arrow slits, and they turned archery into a spectator sport of murder. From outside, they looked like paper-thin cracks. From inside, they widened dramatically, giving archers room to aim while staying nearly invisible. It was the architectural equivalent of trash talk with no consequences. Attackers could fire thousands of arrows at the wall, and 99% would just ping off the stone. Meanwhile, the defender, dry, smug, and underpaid, could calmly return fire with deadly precision. One man, one slit, dozens of new ventilation holes in the enemy ranks. And as siege warfare evolved, so did the slits, proof that even in the Middle Ages, murder had a design philosophy. Those narrow slits in castle walls weren't just for archery. They were the original user interface of despair. Some were cross-shaped for crossbows, circular for early firearms, or angled to cover specific approach routes. The medieval architect wasn't just stacking stones. He was designing an interactive experience of frustration and fatality for anyone dumb enough to attack. Of course, all that defensive genius came with some side effects. Castles were dark, freezing, and about as cheerful as a dungeon-themed refrigerator. Sunlight was practically banned in the name of security. You'd bump into furniture, servants, or entire walls long before you saw them. And when no enemies were around, those same arrow slits were perfect for letting in drafts, rain, and the occasional pigeon with bad timing. Still, they worked. A handful of archers could hold off entire armies, armed with geometry, craftsmanship, and a very smug attitude. The design was so effective that some castles even faked it, carving false arrow slits just to make their fortresses look deadlier. Because nothing says confidence like pretending you have more firepower than you actually do. Arrow slits were simple, silent, and soul-crushingly effective. From the outside, they whispered, "We see you." From the inside, they muttered, "Go ahead, try your luck." And from a safe distance, everyone else said, "You know what? Let's siege somewhere else." If the castle were a body, the keep was its heart, cold, overbuilt, and constantly on the verge of a nervous breakdown. It was the Lord's final refuge, the architectural equivalent of Plan Z. When every other wall had fallen, the gates were gone, and the moat had turned into a communal swamp. Survivors retreated here to wait for salvation, or starvation, whichever arrived first. The keep wasn't designed for comfort. It was designed for panic with style. Walls thick enough to make echoes claustrophobic, staircases built for accidents, and doors so heavy they doubled as gym equipment. Privacy, none. Warmth, barely. Insulation, only emotional. The air was a cocktail of damp stone, smoke, and quiet existential dread. At the top, sat the Lord's Tower, part watchpoint, part bedroom, part paranoia simulator. From there, the Lord could look down on enemies, servants, and taxis, usually with the same suspicion. The genius of the keep was its simplicity. Everything essential: food, weapons, water, and people you didn't quite trust was packed inside. If the castle fell, the keep became a stone bunker before bunkers were cool. Defenders would rain down arrows, boiling oil, and colorful medieval profanity on anyone who came too close. Some even built trapdoors in the upper floors because, once again, gravity remained the best medieval security system. But make no mistake, living in the keep was misery disguised as prestige. It was dark, smoky, and cold enough to make penguins file complaints. Fireplaces heated a 5-foot radius. The rest of the room was pure hypothermia. By winter, you weren't just defending your castle, you were fighting off frostbite and early respiratory failure. Still, the keep was genius in concept. A single fortress of endurance, power, and unrelenting human stubbornness. Every stone whispered, "You might kill us, but you'll die tired." And while lords called them strongholds, everyone inside knew the truth. They were fortresses of constant anxiety. Because nothing says medieval luxury like eating cold stew in a tower while pretending not terrified. Musk. If the keep was the heart, the curtain wall was the skin-thick, unwelcoming, and built by people who didn't believe in personal space. These massive outer defenses wrapped around the castle like a stone hug from someone who secretly wanted you dead. A curtain wall wasn't just a barrier, it was a statement of distrust. It declared, "We don't trust you and we're proud of it." Towering, unyielding, and designed with zero compassion. These walls weren't meant to just survive battles. They were built to outlast time, weather, and the Lord's financial decisions. The brilliance lay in layers. Many castles had 2, even 3 rings of walls. Break through the first, and congratulations, you've earned a one-way ticket to the killing zone. A courtyard designed for maximum regret. Arrows, rocks, boiling water, take your pick. It was the medieval equivalent of a free trial you instantly regretted signing up for. Even the walls themselves were works of violent art. Sloped bases made siege engines slide off. Rounded corners deflected catapults, and parapets let defenders stroll safely while raining chaos below. Every gap, tower, and walkway was mathematically positioned, so there were no blind spots, just pure, efficient misery for the attackers. Of course, this beauty came at a price. Building curtain walls was slow, exhausting, and ruinously expensive. Quarrying, cutting, hauling, and stacking stones took decades and entire generations of peasants born, lived, and died carrying the same wall for the same man who taxed them to build it. The true circle of medieval life. But once complete, the curtain wall turned a castle into a monument to hopelessness. 2 invaders, it said, "You'll die tired." 2 lords, it was art and expression of paranoia in perfect symmetry. To everyone else, it was proof that medieval architects were equal parts mathematician and psychopath. Because no matter how mighty your siege engine was, the curtain wall always had the last word. And that word was denied. If the castle was the masterpiece of medieval defense, the siege was the messy fan art trying to destroy it. Every wall, tower, and gate inspired new and increasingly desperate ways to break them. Thus began the Middle Ages' greatest rivalry, engineers versus gravity. Early attackers relied on enthusiasm and poor decision-making, mostly ladders. A few brave souls would sprint toward a 40-foot wall, holding what was essentially a tree branch, hoping physics took the day off. It rarely did. After enough broken spines, someone finally said, "Let's try math." Enter the trebuchet, the Middle Ages answer to, what if we built a catapult that could ruin a city from half a mile away? Using counterweights, leverage, and spite, these machines hurled 300-pound stones with surgical precision. Entire teams of medieval engineers dedicated their lives to calculating angles, weight, and trajectory, turning destruction into advanced geometry homework. Then came the battering ram, less precise, more personal. A giant log on chains swung rhythmically until either the gate or the soldiers gave up first. The sound of a castle gate splintering under centuries of teamwork was psychological warfare at its purest. Defenders fought back with equal creativity, boiling water, scalding oil, burning sand, whatever the budget allowed. Some even built secondary walls behind the first, forcing attackers to start over, like a historical rage quit. But medieval sieges were rarely fast. They were long, miserable, and weirdly bureaucratic. Some lasted months, others years. Entire armies camped outside, watching the defenders starve, freeze, and argue. Eventually, both sides just got bored and signed a truce. In the end, hunger won more wars than bravery ever did. But every siege made both sides smarter. It was an arms race between stone and science, who could outthink the other before running out of food or morale. Medieval warfare proved what every student still knows today: math hurts. From the outside, a medieval castle looked majestic, towering walls, fluttering banners, the very symbol of power and prestige. Inside, it was basically a damp refrigerator full of yelling people and questionable hygiene. Life in a castle wasn't glamorous. It was loud, smoky, and eternally cold. The same walls that stopped catapults also trapped drafts and cooking fumes. Every room smelled faintly of wet stone, burnt meat, and quiet despair. At the center of it all was the Great Hall, the beating heart of medieval chaos. A combination dining room, courtroom, party venue, and occasional battleground. Dogs roamed freely, servants tripped over armor, and someone was always yelling about taxes, while another snored under the table. Heat was a luxury, order a rumor, and silence an urban legend. But to the medieval lord, this was home proof that he had survived both the elements and his own architecture. Fireplaces the size of small houses struggled to warm more than a few feet of air. Everyone else huddled close, coughing on smoke before winter could finish the job. Windows, tiny slits, great for archery, useless for daylight. Candles helped, assuming you enjoyed paying for fire hazards. And the toilets, or garderobes, if you wanted to sound sophisticated, were basically holes in the wall, with a long drop straight down the castle's side. Ingenious for the time, horrifying by any modern standard. Some even emptied into moats, turning your defensive water feature into a biological weapon. The smell alone could end a siege. Food was plentiful, but rarely pleasant. Fresh meat was for nobles. Everyone else got whatever could be boiled until it forgot what it used to be. Bread doubled as plates, then compost. And if you think the diet was bad, imagine the dentistry. Still, people took pride in living there. To outsiders, the castle meant privilege and protection. Inside, it meant endurance, surviving by stubbornness alone. You ignored the rats, embraced the cold, and called the dripping ceiling atmosphere for all its misery. The castle was the heart of medieval life, a monument to paranoia and persistence. It kept you alive, just uncomfortable enough to remind you you still were. Living in a fortress meant you were safe, smoky, and slightly frozen, but not dead. Castles weren't just fortresses. They were reminders, massive, immovable proof that someone richer than you owned everything you could see. For lords and kings, castles weren't built merely to defend land. They were built to control it. You didn't need to patrol every road when your fortress sat on the horizon like a divine threat, the medieval equivalent of a blue checkmark, public, visible, and slightly insufferable. Every castle was propaganda in stone. Its walls didn't just repel enemies, they broadcast obedience. The message was clear. Loyalty means safety. Rebellion means suicide. Everything about castle design reinforced hierarchy. The Lord's chamber sat high above everyone, partly for defense, mostly for ego. Visitors climbed endless staircases to reach him, arriving physically exhausted and emotionally submissive. Even the Great Hall was psychological warfare. The Lord sat elevated at the far end, his guests below, lit by smoky torches that made everyone look slightly guilty. Architecture became surveillance. From the battlements, guards could watch every field, every road, every questionable life choice in the village. If someone rebelled, the castle saw it first. If someone fled, the castle watched them fail in real time. It was medieval security. No cameras required, just people who never blinked. To common folk, the castle loomed like a stone god. They built it, supplied it, and feared it, yet would never step inside unless something had gone terribly wrong. To the Lord, it was home. To everyone else, it was a shadow that never slept. And yet, in all its cold brilliance, the castle achieved exactly what it was meant to. Peace through intimidation. Loyalty through fear. Order through architecture. It wasn't just a building. It was feudalism carved in granite. By the late Middle Ages, castles had done their job too well. Then came gunpowder. Cannons made centuries of craftsmanship feel suddenly inadequate. All those proud fortresses became expensive piles of soon-to-be rubble. And so, the nobility did what the nobility always does. When function fails, redecorate. The fortress evolved into something new. Part palace, part status symbol, part stone ego trip. Thick, defensive walls were now filled with comfort, or at least the medieval idea of it. Curtains, carpets, windows that actually opened. The horror. Defensive towers became bedrooms. Moats turned into gardens. Arrow slits widened into scenic views. A design decision that would given earlier lords an aneurysm. Where once poured boiling oil, now flowed imported wine. The age of fortification became the age of flauntification. Comfort became the new buzzword. Central fireplaces spread warmth instead of smoke. Tapestries lined the walls, partly for insulation, mostly to brag that someone else's embroidery now belonged to you. Kitchens expanded, not to feed armies, but to roast peacocks for dinner parties. The feudal age of fear had quietly morphed into the Renaissance age of showing off. Of course, some nobles couldn't let go of tradition. They still built mock battlements and fake arrow slits, not for defense, but for aesthetic intimidation. Because nothing says old money like a decorative murder hole. By the 15th century, the castle had retired from warfare and entered its luxury era, the medieval equivalent of a sports car. Unnecessary, ostentatious, and perfect for impressing people you secretly despised. But there was genius in that transformation. The medieval castle, born from chaos and fear, reinvented itself as art. No longer a fortress of war, now a fortress of taste. It stood as a monument to humanity's favorite pastime, turning survival into style. And while cannons roared outside, inside the lords were too busy debating tapestry, color schemes to notice. For nearly 5 centuries, castles were Europe's unbreakable insurance policy. Stone giants laughing at ladders and sneering at siege towers. Then one day, someone rolled up with a cannon and said, "Try me." Gunpowder changed everything. Those mighty walls that had shrugged off centuries of stones and fire now crumbled like stale bread. What used to take months of siege could be done in an afternoon with enough cannonballs and optimism. Medieval warfare evolved overnight. The castle, humanity's proudest defensive invention, went out of style faster than chainmail underwear. The irony was brutal. The stronger the castle, the louder it exploded. Centuries of geometry, physics, and paranoia betrayed by progress. Cannonballs turned pride into rubble, towers into dust, and keeps into smoking reminders that, well, that escalated quickly. Lords tried to adapt, lowering walls, widening moats, building earthen ramparts to absorb blasts, but by the 16th century, the writing was on the wall, and the wall was on the ground. The age of stone had given way to the age of science. As castles fell, palaces rose. If you couldn't defend your wealth, you might as well flaunt it. Battlements became balconies. Arrow slits became stained glass. Drawbridges became decorative fountains. Power was no longer measured in fortifications, but in chandeliers. The feudal lord faded, replaced by the bureaucrat with better lighting. The once roaring castles fell silent, turned into ruins, monasteries, prisons, and eventually tourist attractions. Peasants who once trembled beneath their shadows now picnicked in their courtyards. The fall of the castle wasn't failure, was progress. Humanity had simply outgrown its stone cages. Cannons didn't just end sieges, they ended an era. And yet, even in ruin, castles refused to disappear. They lingered like proud ghosts of an age that refused to be forgotten. Because even when you blow them up, you still look up. That's the power of a castle. It never truly falls, just waits for the next century to admire it. Their stones still talk, cracked, mossy, and quietly smug. They've outlasted kings, wars, tourists, and teenagers with spray paint. Not bad for buildings designed by people who thought bathing was suspicious. The true legacy of castles isn't just military, it's psychological. They taught Europe to think in stone. Every wall was patience. Every tower was fear disguised as confidence. Castles weren't just fortresses, they were therapy for an anxious civilization. Stand inside one today, beneath the cold arches and arrow slits, and you can feel it. The weight of human ambition, paranoia, and craftsmanship pressing down from every direction. It's like history itself, whispering, "You would have died here." Modern architects still borrow from them symmetry, grandeur, vertical dominance. Skyscrapers are just castles that discovered glass, corporate headquarters, fortresses that swapped archers for interns. The instinct remains the same. Keep the power in, keep everyone else out. But beyond all symbolism, castles endure because they capture something primal, the human need to build something that says, "I was here." Lords, peasants, masons, all chasing immortality, one stone at a time. And somehow, it worked. Today they're backdrops for weddings, video games, and slow-motion drone shots, repurposed monuments to human stubbornness. We romanticize them, pretending the past was noble and the drafty rooms were charming. The truth is simpler. Castles weren't magical, they were necessary, and in that necessity they became beautiful. So when the wind howls through a ruined tower and tourists snap selfies where knights once panicked, remember this: castles were never about perfection. They were about survival, dressed as art. They were fear turned into architecture. And even as their walls crumble, the idea behind them never dies. Because every fortress, no matter how broken, still stands for the same ancient truth we endure. The air over Boston Harbor hung heavy with the smell of salt and defiance. Winter had settled early that year, the kind that bit through wool and bone alike, and the city seemed to hold its breath beneath the gray December sky. Streets were narrow veins of mud and snow, carrying whispers instead of wagons. In the taverns and meeting halls, men leaned close over tankards, speaking words they should not say aloud, words like freedom, tax, and rebellion. To the crown, they were subjects. To each other, they were becoming something else. Samuel Adams walked quickly through the crooked lanes near Griffin's Wharf, his breath clouding before him, his coat pulled tight. He could hear the hum of the crowd gathering already, the restless pulse of a city that had been pushed too far. For months, the ships had waited in the harbor, their holds stuffed with tea that no one dared unload. The East India Company had sent it as a test of obedience. The king demanded that the colonists drink their loyalty. Boston had answered with silence. Now silence was about to break. Inside the Old South Meeting House, the crowd packed shoulder to shoulder, hundreds of men, artisans, dock workers, merchants, and farmers, all crammed beneath the rafters. Candles flickered over faces etched with frustration and hunger. Samuel Adams stood at the front, his voice rising above the murmurs. "This meeting," he declared, "can do nothing more to save the country." It was a signal, not of defeat, but of decision. Outside, the word spread like lightning. The time had come. Down by the wharf, the air grew sharper. Men began to move with purpose, their steps muffled in the snow. They did not wear uniforms. They were carpenters, blacksmiths, sailors, and apprentices. But tonight, they were something more: ghosts of defiance. Some smeared ash on their faces. Others pulled blankets over their shoulders, mimicking the Mohawk warriors of the frontier. It wasn't disguise. Not really, it was symbolism. They were no longer subjects of Britain. They were spirits of the new world, rising against the old. Among them was a young apprentice named Eli Turner, barely 20, hands calloused from work at the docks. His heart thudded so hard, he thought the British could hear it across the harbor. He had never seen a battle, never fired a musket, but he understood what was at stake. He carried a small hatchet, not for violence, but for opening crates. The real weapon was unity. The ships loomed in the dark water like sleeping beasts, the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Their masts pierced the night sky, black against the stars. The harbor was quiet, except for the slap of waves against wood and the creak of ropes in the cold wind. Then came the first shout, low but fierce. "Boston Harbor, a teapot tonight." Laughter rippled through the crowd, tense and electric. Eli climbed aboard the Dartmouth behind a man named Lendell Pitts, his boots slipping on the icy planks. The ship smelled of tar and salt and empire. "No damage, but to the tea," someone said sharply. "We are not thieves. We are patriots." The men nodded. The code was clear: no harm to the crew. No looting, no fire. This was not chaos. It was a message. With hatchets raised, they smashed open the first chest. The sound was almost musical. The crack of wood, followed by the hiss of tea spilling into the cold night air. Leaves scattered like dark snow, the cargo of an empire undone. The men worked in rhythm, fast and methodical. Crate after crate split apart, the harbor water turning black with tea. The wind carried the scent across the dockspitter, smoky, unmistakable. From the shore, townspeople watched in silence. Some cheered quietly, others simply stared, awed by the audacity of it. Women wrapped in shawls held lanterns close, the light catching flakes of snow that drifted down like ash. One child whispered, "Mama, will the king be angry?" The mother only said, "He will notice." On the ships, the work continued. Eli's hands were numb, his fingers bleeding from splinters, but he didn't stop. Every chest he split felt like cutting through fear itself. He thought of his father, who had fought in the last war for the same crown that now demanded their obedience. He thought of the taxes that emptied his mother's purse. He thought of the word freedom and how it tasted on his tongue like salt and smoke and danger. By midnight, over 90,000 pounds of tea floated in the harbor. The men stood in the cold, watching it drift, a sea of sacrifice steeped in rebellion. "That's enough," someone said. "Let no man take even a leaf." The order was law. Every nail, every crate was accounted for. The decks were swept clean. When they left, it was as if the ships had never carried tea at all. They moved quietly through the streets, melting into the shadows. No torches, no shouts, no looting, just the sound of snow underfoot and the distant toll of a church bell. Boston slept uneasily, but history had already woken. At dawn, the harbor looked like ink. The sun rose red over the water, casting long reflections over the floating leaves. The British ships stood silent, their flags still, as if stunned. Word spread quickly. By noon, every tavern and street corner in Boston buzzed with the same whispered phrase, "They did it." In London, it would take weeks for the news to arrive, but when it did, it would strike like thunder. The king would call it treason. Parliament would call it vandalism. But for Boston, it was something holier. It was proof that ordinary men could shake an empire. Eli returned to his small room near Fish Street. He sat by the window, hands still stained with tea and splinters. Outside, the snow had turned brown where the harbor winds carried the scent of rebellion. He could still hear the crack of wood, the rush of tea pouring into the water, the echo of freedom beginning to find its voice. For weeks after, the tension grew like a storm behind closed doors. British officials fumed, merchants worried. Some colonists condemned the act, calling it madness. Others defended it as the only language tyranny understood. Boston became a city under watch. Soldiers patrolled, muskets gleaming in the pale winter sun. But beneath that surface of order, something deeper stirred. In taverns, whispers turned into plans. In church halls, prayers turned into pledges. The Sons of Liberty met in secret, swearing that what had begun in Boston would not end there. The harbor might have been calm again, but the current beneath was unstoppable. Eli saw it in the eyes of the people around, hymn dock workers, blacksmiths, housewives, and even schoolboys. Fear was still there, but so was pride. A quiet burning pride that refused to bow. He carried that fire in him, knowing that what they had done would change everything. When British newspapers finally printed the news, they called it the Act of Savages. The irony was not lost on Boston. Savages, Eli muttered, watching the soldiers march through the streets. No, just men who've had enough. The punishment came swiftly. The harbor was closed. Trade halted. Food grew scarce. The coercive acts, they called them laws, meant to break the will of Boston. But instead, they bound the colonies together. What began as anger became unity. Letters passed from town to town, from colony to colony, carrying words of defiance. The tea that sank in Boston Harbor had rippled across a continent. One night, months later, Eli stood again by the same water. Ice rimmed the edges of the harbor now, and ships sat idle, their sails furled in the silence of oppression. He thought of that night, the faces, the cold, the smell of tea. He wondered if the king, across the sea, understood what had truly happened here. That this wasn't about tea or taxes anymore. It was about dignity. It was about claiming the right to breathe free air without permission. In the distance, he saw lanterns flicker in the homes along the docks. Ordinary lights, ordinary people, but together. They were something extraordinary. He smiled, a small, knowing smile. Rebellion wasn't a single night. It was a beginning. And in that moment, Boston didn't feel small. It felt infinite, as if the entire world had tilted and the first spark of a new era had just been struck. The harbor slept, but beneath the frozen water lay a secret that would never sink. The harbor that once smelled of salt and defiance now reeked of punishment. Winter had turned to spring, but Boston felt colder than ever. The British had struck back with a vengeance, swift and merciless. The coercive acts, they called them in London. In Boston, people called them what they were: chains. The port was closed, its waters empty, except for the hulks of warships that loomed like iron sentinels. No trade, no ships, no food. The heart of the city had been strangled, and every hungry stomach felt it. Eli Turner stood on the wharf one morning, staring at the silent water. Where once he had worked unloading cargo and hauling rope, now he saw only emptiness. The seagulls circled lazily overhead, shrieking as if mocking the silence below. British soldiers patrolled the docks, their red coats bright as blood against the gray fog. One of them kicked a barrel and laughed, his musket swinging casually over his shoulder. Eli looked away before the soldier's gaze could catch his. The people had learned that even a stare could invite trouble now. Inside the city, shops were shuttered. Taverns whispered instead of sang. Soldiers occupied homes without permission, sleeping in beds that weren't theirs, eating food that others had gone hungry for. Every knock on the door carried the threat of a uniform behind it. Yet, beneath that fear, something else simmered in anger that refused to die. Boston had been punished for its defiance, but punishment had only made its spirit harder, sharper. Samuel Adams still moved through the city, quiet but relentless. He met men in taverns after dark, spoke in codes, and passed messages disguised as grocery lists. He wasn't just fighting for Boston now. He was fighting for every colony that watched what was happening here and wondered who would be next. "If they can close our harbor," he said one night, his voice low, "they can close yours. If they can take our bread, they can take your freedom. Will you wait until the chain reaches your door?" The men around him nodded, grim-faced. The idea of America was still fragile, but it was forming piece by piece, meeting by meeting, whisper by whisper. Eli's days grew longer and emptier. Work had dried up with the ships, and he spent his hours repairing nets for fishermen who could no longer fish. At night, he met with others in a small tavern near the north end, where the smell of stale ale mixed with the weight of conspiracy. There, they listened to men from other towns, Salem, Portsmouth, even New York, who had come to see the city that had dared to stand against the king. They called Boston a martyr, and in that word, Eli felt both pride and sorrow. The British governor, General Thomas Gage, ruled the city now. He was a soldier first, and his patience had limits. Order, he told his officers, must be restored. But order, when enforced by bayonets, is a fragile thing. The more he marched his troops through the streets, the more hatred followed in their wake. Every red coat became a target of scorn, every British flag a reminder of humiliation. Children threw stones when soldiers passed. Women turned their backs. Men clenched their fists until their knuckles went white. The city was quiet, but it was not loyal. One evening, Eli walked home past the Old South Meeting House and saw a line of soldiers at attention. Behind them, a wagon rattled through the square, carrying barrels of gunpowder. A group of townsfolk stood watching, silent but unyielding. The soldiers glanced at them nervously, fingers brushing their triggers. For a moment, time held still. Then a child dropped a bucket, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The soldiers flinched, the crowd tensed, and Eli felt his heart stop, but no one moved. The wagon rolled on. That was Boston, now a city where even a sound could start a war. Outside Massachusetts, word of the punishment spread like fire through dry grass. In Philadelphia, Charleston, and New York, people began to send food and supplies to Boston. Wagons arrived with flour, rice, and salted meat. Boston's fight is our fight, they said. It was the first time the colonies had acted as one, and the British saw too late that in trying to crush rebellion, they had created unity. In September, a group of delegates gathered in Philadelphia the First Continental Congress. Samuel Adams went, along with his cousin John and others who had carried the weight of rebellion on their shoulders. They debated, argued, and prayed, but in the end, they agreed on one thing. The colonies would stand together. They would petition the king, yes, but they would also prepare. The word independence wasn't yet spoken aloud, but it hovered in every heart like a ghost waiting to be named. Eli stayed behind in Boston, trapped inside a city that felt more like a prison with every passing day. The soldiers drilled daily in the commons, their drums echoing through the narrow streets. He could see them from his window rows of red, moving with mechanical precision. They were training for something, though no one yet dared to say what. The tension was like a storm waiting on the horizon, visible but not yet breaking. Then came the rumors, British spies whispering about hidden gunpowder stores in Concord, colonists stockpiling weapons, men drilling secretly under cover of darkness. The words militia and minute men began to spread, carrying the promise of resistance. The air in every tavern grew heavier. Even the church bells seemed to ring differently now, slower, more deliberate. One night, Eli met Samuel Adams again, this time in a small candlelit room behind a printing shop. Adams's face was gaunt, his eyes burning with quiet determination. "They think they can starve us into submission," he said softly. "But hunger only sharpens resolve. The king believes we are subjects. It's time he learns we are citizens." He placed a hand on Eli's shoulder. "If they march for the powder, we will be ready." Eli nodded, though his stomach twisted. He had never fought in a battle, never seen war, up close. He thought of muskets flashing, bayonets glinting, men bleeding in the snow. But he also thought of the Tiavi that night on the harbor, when ordinary men had defied an empire and lived. He took a breath. "Then we'll be ready," he said. Winter returned, and with it the cold iron grip of occupation. The British were everywhere, now on street corners, in taverns, even outside churches. Their officers swaggered through town as if it already belonged to them. But in back rooms and barns, patriots whispered and waited. Muskets were hidden under floorboards. Powder was smuggled in barrels of flour. The city's silence had become the stillness before a storm. On a frozen January night, Eli and a small group of men carried crates down to the harbor this time. Not tea, but gunpowder and shot. They moved quickly, their breath steaming in the dark. "For Concord," someone murmured. "For what's coming?" The wind whipped off the water, biting their faces. As they worked, Eli looked out across the black harbor and saw his reflection shivering in the ripples. "It's begun already," he whispered. By March, tension was no longer a rumor, it was a heartbeat. One spark, everyone said, just one spark. And that spark came soon. The British began to move on the outskirts, probing, searching, trying to seize colonial stores of weapons. Each skirmish brought them closer to open war. Each rumor of gunfire made the city hold its breath. Eli felt it the night before it happened. The wind was restless, the lamps flickered strangely, and the streets seemed too quiet. He walked to the wharf, the same planks where he had first defied the crown, and looked out over the harbor. The water was black and still, but he could almost hear it, whispered the ghosts of the tea, the echoes of defiance. He closed his eyes and saw that first chest split open, the tea spilling like blood. None of them had known then what it would lead to. But now the truth was clear. That night hadn't ended anything. It had begun everything. Somewhere in the darkness, a bell began to toll. Slow, distant, warning. Eli turned toward the city, heart pounding. Men were already running through the streets, whispering words that would change history. "The regulars are marching." The bell's cry rolled through the sleeping streets of Boston like thunder, warning of a storm that had finally arrived. Eli Turner ran, his boots striking the cobblestones, breath freezing in the cold night air. Around him, windows flicked open, voices whispered, and doors creaked as men emerged half-dressed, muskets in hand. The city wasn't surprised, only waiting. For months, every rumor had pointed to this. Now it was no longer rumor. The British were on the move. Lantern light flickered through the mist, casting ghostly shapes across the walls. Eli darted through an alley toward the north end, where Samuel Adams and John Hancock had been hiding. He burst into the tavern where they gathered, his chest heaving. "They're marching," he gasped. Across the river headed for Concord. Adams looked up from the table, his expression calm but grave. "Then it begins," he said quietly. Hancock poured himself a small glass of brandy, his hand trembling only slightly. "Let them march," he murmured. "The countryside won't sleep through this one." Word spread faster than the soldiers could march. Riders galloped through the dark countryside, shouting warnings into the night. "The regulars are coming." They pounded down muddy roads, through sleeping villages, across frozen fields. Windows opened, muskets were grabbed, and by dawn the Massachusetts countryside had become a hive of movement. Farmers, blacksmiths, and tradesmen, all Minutemen, now gathered at crossroads, eyes hard with resolve. Eli joined a group near Lexington. where the road from Boston curved between fields, still heavy with morning mist. The air was cold, sharp, expectant. Birds were silent. The sun rose slow and pale, its light touching the barrels of the muskets lined along the village green. Across the way, redcoats marched into view, their bayonets glinting like a wall of fire. Drums beat. Orders were shouted. The earth seemed to hold its breath. Captain John Parker stood before the gathered militia, his voice low but steady. "Stand your ground," he said. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Eli's fingers tightened on his musket. He could feel his pulse in his throat, in his hands, in the air itself. The British officer barked a command. No one moved. For a heartbeat, the two sides stared at each other across the damp grass, the Empire and the farmers who dared defy it. Then, somewhere in the stillness, a single shot cracked the air. No one knew who fired first, but the world changed in that instant. Smoke filled the field, muskets roared, men fell. Eli dropped to one knee, fired blindly into the haze, and felt the shock of recoil jolt through his arms. The sound was chaos screams, gunfire, the thudding of boots. When the smoke cleared, bodies lay on the grass, red and blue, mingled with the same color of blood. He stared, breathless. There was no going back now. The T had started a protest. This was revolution.